Good afternoon. It is January 21st, and we're discussing Crown Heights, the one with Howie Mandel.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. I hope you had a chance to see this movie from 2004, based on real life events that happened in, I think, 1991 in um, uh, in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. Just a couple of years after I moved out of Brooklyn. So I left Brooklyn in 1988 when I was ordained. So, um, but certainly as someone says in the movie, that when you have that much fuel, it only takes a little spark. You know that if you have that much gas, it only takes a little spark to start a fire. So in the late 80s in Brooklyn, you could see that the the tinder was growing for the bonfire, so say. But now, by the way, that neighborhood is completely gentrified and completely different. The movie was not filmed in New York, by the way. The Toronto, probably because it was cheaper, was
Mhm.
the stand-in for Crown Heights. Um, so I thought as I was watching, I said, I don't really recognize this neighborhood. And then in the final credits, I realized that, oh, it's because they didn't actually film in New York, other than a couple of exterior scenes right at the beginning where you see the Brooklyn Bridge, right? And to set the stage, but everything else was filmed somewhere else. So um, so it's based on some real people. Right? So the Dr. Laz or Laz, do they call him Dr. Laz in the movie?
I
Because
think
he,
just
Just
Laz.
laugh.
yeah,
Laugh.
he is a doctor. He has a doctorate in education from accredited universities, and the organization that he helped found there, which was called Project Cure at the time, but is now Project Cure the World, because there's another Project Cure, which is about bringing medicine and doctors to places around the world. So I think they went to Project Cure the World. The website is primitive and old-fashioned, but it exists. So uh, and over the years has won kind of all kinds of awards for their work bringing people together. So the Mother Hale Award, the Martin Luther King Fulfilling the Dream Award, the New York Foundation's Peace Award, the John Lindsay Award, things like that. So the movie is actually based on a book that Dr. Lazarson, that's where the Laz comes from, wrote about sharing the neighborhood. And some of the songs, the rap songs in the movie, are actually the songs that he wrote back in the day for that. Yeah, that's it. You can see it's
Mhm.
I don't know that anyone's updated that in a long, long time, but there he is, the real guy on the right with Richie Havens. That's not the character that Melvin Van Peebles plays in the film, and he's actually branched out since then to work with um, educational issues, educational disabilities, and autism in particular. So, but so interesting. This movie is directed by Jeremy Kagan. This is actually the third Jeremy Kagan movie that we've watched. So this is a guy who he's Jewish. He was born in Mount Vernon, New York, in 1945, and you know, one of the movies that he made is very high on our list for real Jewish classics, The Chosen.
Mm.
Right? Watch that one. We also watched a a detective movie he made starring Richard Dreyfuss. So some of you may remember those movies. We watched The Chosen. We watched The Big Fix. That's the Richard Dreyfuss movie where he plays a Jewish detective, Moses Wine. Right? He also, in more recent years, made a movie of the stage play Golda's Balcony about Golda Meir with Tova Feldshuh in it. So, um, it's been more quiet in recent years. I think he's actually done a lot of organizational work. Jeremy
did.
Kagan won the Humanitas Award for this movie and was nominated for Directors Guild Award for directing this film in particular. But this is an interesting path for a filmmaker. He went to Harvard University. He got his master's from NYU, not in film, and is now a tenured professor at the University of Southern California Film School. So, um, so he's um, made a variety of, I'd say, well-respected films, but not no blockbusters in there, and his work is smaller and somewhat more personal. This is one of his bigger canvases, I'd say, of
He was here to
for a
turn the
movie.
light in.
So an interesting film. The screenplay was co-written by Michael D'Antonio and Tony Ann Johnson, both of whom are African American, I believe. And uh, he Michael D'Antonio is much better known as a journalist than he is as a screenplay writer. I think he's only got one other screenplay on his bio, a movie called Deacons for Defense. Um, and which I think was a civil rights movie, if memory serves. But more recently, he wrote a book that actually was on the bestseller list for nonfiction called Never Enough: Donald Trump and the Pursuit of Success. So in the last few years, as I understand it, I haven't read it, but it's really about for Donald Trump, nothing is ever enough, right? No, well, that makes sense, right? And very recently, he wrote a book called Renegade with Adam Kinzinger. So, he's written a lot of political books of various kinds. I believe he won there he is, yeah. And he won the 1984 Pulitzer, actually. Don't remember which book that's for, but Tony Ann Johnson is an actress as well as a writer, and she wrote and appeared in a movie about Ruby Bridges. Remember the little girl who was one of the first to integrate a school. So she's written a couple of other things. A few years ago, she won the Flannery O'Connor Award for the best short story collection. The name of that book, I believe, is Light Skin Gone to Waste. So she's an African American, but you can see with light skin. Right? Um, so they collaborated on the screenplay, and then of course we get to the cast, and you may recognize a few folks here. Um, so Howie Mandel in particular, the story of Howie Mandel becoming a successful stand-up comedian is like an old-time Hollywood story. He's a Canadian. He was visiting Los Angeles with some friends. They went to the Comedy Store, I think it was, and it was amateur night. And his friends convinced him to get up on stage, and he went up on stage on amateur night and ended up with there he is as a young man there, right? He ended up with an agent and appearances out of that night, right? And from then on, essentially, um, became who he's become. He went on tour as the opening act for David Letterman back before Letterman had his late night show. He, um, went on to appear as Wayne Fiscus, Dr. Wayne Fiscus in Saint Elsewhere back in 1982. In the movie Gremlins, he's the voice of Gizmo, one of the Gremlins. Right? He's come along with a variety of film roles, and nowadays I think makes most of his money through game shows and talent shows. Right? As the host of Deal or No Deal for several years, which I think was a pretty lucrative job for him, and as a judge on America's Got Talent. Um, You might also know that he's had a pretty high profile in terms of dealing with his OCD issues and as a germaphobe, and he's got a book called "Here's the Deal, Don't Touch Me," which is his OCD journey. So. Um, Mario Van Peebles plays Paul Richards in the movie, and Mario Van Peebles is one of those multi-hyphenate guys. He writes, he directs, he acts, and he comes from a family like that. His father, Melvin Van Peebles, was also a multi-hyphenate. And Mario Van Peebles' first roles as an actor were in his father's films. And now I think he's got children and perhaps even grandchildren in the movie business as well. So um, all of their names begin with the letter M. I discovered that in doing a little research. It's just not you can see his son there is Mandela Van Peebles, but his parents were Melvin and Marcia, right? They named him Mario, and his sisters are Megan and Max, Marguerite and Michaela, and his children are Maya, Marley, Mandela, and Morgana. Okay, so um, among his early roles, he played Malcolm X in the movie Ali. So not the Malcolm X movie that Spike Lee made, but the biopic of Muhammad Ali. And as a director, he made the movie New Jack City, which kind of put him on the map as a director. So, um, you know, two good talents in the leads in this role. The the other folks not so well known, right? The young. First of all, they're not a whole lot of major roles in this movie, right? It's interesting. It's the two of them and the two boys. And other than that, it's everybody else is kind of in and out of the movie. Um, but I'm looking up the guys who play TJ and Udi. They have very few film credits. Those guys, so they basically did this. Yeah, this guy Jeremy Blackman. Um, he was in a movie called Magnolia, which was a pretty well respected movie. There he is. So he was even younger when he was in Magnolia and doesn't really have screen credits since then. Right? So, um, and so it's really those guys. Then, so I'd say a lot of this movie is in the director and the editor in particular. I mean, there's a lot of this movie is edited almost like it's a rock video. It's a lot of quick cuts. It moves pretty fast. And then you have effects that are like things out of a rock video. Like you probably noticed the scene where the two boys are sitting, I think, on a sofa, and behind them there are two windows, and in those windows, images keep changing and appearing, right? So that they're images of Martin Luther King, Adolf Hitler, and all these images that are meant to evoke some of the differences that the two communities have in Crown Heights. Right? Um, so I think it's very much about that direction and editing, and less so about the characters themselves. And even the character development, in a certain sense, takes backstage to it. I mean, there is certainly some dramatic arc of these characters that they become um, something closer to friends over time, right? But I do think the movie does a good job in not sort of going overboard with that, right? Taking these antagonistic communities and turning them into the best of friends, right? I think the movie does well when it's moments where they're having that kind of sit in a circle encounter group, and at the end they get them to all stand up and hold hands. It's hard enough to get a group of boys of any kind to stand up and hold hands, but to go across these barriers between the communities, even harder. So, so I think the movie does a really nice job of mixing in these, uh, archival film footage from what was going on in Crown Heights. They have interviews, sort of like interviews on the street that keep popping up to sort of comment on the action in the movie. Um, Most of those I don't think are archival. I think they're staged for the film. But I think a couple of them at the beginning, especially, are actually archival interviews with people in the community. But as the film goes on, I think those are actually actors. Um, where the language for those interviews come from, I can't say whether that's the invention of the authors and stuff, but it certainly represents points of view in the Black community and in the Jewish community. So I really think that that's an interesting technique that does remind me of rock videos of the time, these kind of quick cuts and things like that. I found myself trying to keep notes on this film and unable to keep up because they talk fast and it moves fast, and you get 10 seconds of this little head in interposed into the screen. So hard to keep up, but I think the story is not hard to keep up with, right? The general arc of it. And there are some moments that I like. I mean, I like the last moment where they see each other across the subway platform, right? So here's two guys going in different directions, you know, and that's a pretty good metaphor. And they can share something across the platform, but then they're gone, right? And so, a lot of our relationships in life are like that, right? They come and go sometimes. Um, you know, both of these kids have grown from the experience, I think it's fair to say. But the movie doesn't go over the top and so that, this is all going to be just fine, right? There when one of the kids says to the others, I will never see it the way you see it. That's that's one of the more astute comments that anybody makes in the movie. There's a lot of good Jewish stuff mixed in here. A lot of talk about Tikkun Olam, and Lashon Hara, evil speech, speaking badly about another without really knowing them. Um, so they have a whole song about don't judge a book by its cover. The Jewish version of that is you can't tell the wine from the bottle that it's in. So that comes from the Pirkei Avot, the sayings of our ancestors. Um, don't judge the wine by the bottle. So, um, um, you know, the what else? You know, I like the scene where early on they discover that they both have red vans and they go out to do something in the community and just let me see if I can find my note on this, but um, you know, Van Peebles' character calls out to these kids and shouts at them to go home, and the rabbi calls out to the Jewish boys by name and says, "Go home before I call your parents." Right? You know, so there's just some turns of phrase that fit the characters, I think. Um, you know, uh, the leader of the Hasidic rabbis in Crown Heights is Menachem Schneerson. His picture appears in the movie. Um, there's the scene where Laz is called in to headquarters, essentially, which is on Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and given an assignment from the Rebbe to do something about this, right? To that to bring the communities together. And as he walks out, he looks and he sees a picture of the Rebbe, and he says, "Thanks." He goes out and tries to do this work. Um, so it, there's some very clever moments where I think Howie Mandel gets to be show some of his humor in a kind of a gentle vein here. But um, it's a movie about tradition. It's a movie about the heritage of the African American community, and the questions of culture and the lack of culture and the lack of history. It's really an interesting, in that sense, it doesn't shy away from, I think, some big issues and doesn't resolve them, right? There, some of these things are beyond simple resolution, but the idea of making peace and being in the same place together is a pretty valuable one. There's the scene where Laz comes in having read about the comments that Louis Farrakhan made about Judaism being a gutter religion and Hitler being a hero, and trying to parse that discussion between Jews and African Americans is a really interesting and difficult one. One of those places where it's hard to see the world through each other's eyes, right? So, um, near the end of it, I think Van Peebles quotes uh, the founder of Black Islam, right, Elijah Muhammad, and says, uh, "Teach the children, and the older generation will come along." Right, and um, so it's sort of an example of that. There are these, uh, why is Farrakhan so popular in the African American community? To Jews, that seems like a mystery to us. But in the Nation of Islam has been building youth centers in the inner cities for decades, right? They're the only people building those places in the inner cities, basketball courts and things like that. So they've done what they said they were going to do. They taken a group of young Black Americans, given them a place to be, given them a place where they feel um, comfortable, where they feel respected. It shouldn't surprise us that much that the bad sides of the Nation of Islam creep into all of their ways of thinking about the world, right? So, and now I'm editorializing, but it's what we've left behind, in the inner cities is not a pretty picture, right? And so the Nation of Islam has stepped into that empty space. And if we want to change that, we have to do something about the footprint that we left. Anyway, so um, so I like it. I mean, I don't know that it's on anyone's big list of classics, right? But it's definitely fits in the Jewish classics, right? So, what do you guys think? What did you see? How do you feel about it? Not that much, apparently.
Wait, wait. Are you trying to unmute?
I thought I was unmuted.
Oh
Um,
no, now you are.
right now you're unmuted.
I thought it got draggy at the end,
Uh-huh.
and I felt they were trying to almost tie it up into a pretty package.
Yeah.
And um, I I hope it really works, but I'm somewhat skeptical.
Yeah. I do think you're right at the end. I don't know if it drags for me as much as it gets so episodic at the end that it doesn't feel connected, right? I mean, it
Right.
goes it's somewhere in there you realize there isn't going to be a really satisfactory character arc that ties things up, and what you get instead is little talking heads, Um, so and the relationship with the boys is not deeply played out in a sense, right? They keep falling apart and coming back together, but we don't really get the sense of the work that either of them undertakes in order to do that. I think the first half of the movie, where you see them gradually come to some understanding of each other, is better than the latter half when, they're fighting by the side of the road and then they're back in rehearsal. It
Right.
doesn't really give us the missing pieces in a sense. So I would tend to agree with that. That's why I don't think it's a classic classic. It's only a Jewish classic. You know.
I found it very poignant when the African-American child said, his father didn't have a job, etc. And then Yudi said, my dad is also
Right. On food stamps.
unemployed.
Yeah.
And I think it took many, many years for us to really accept the fact that there are Jews that were unemployed,
Mhm.
as when there were Jews that were hungry. When the
Yeah.
Ark first got started, I remember the foundation of the Ark, that there
Mhm.
were, quote, hungry Jews
Yeah.
out there. And
Yeah.
I found that very poignant.
Right. There are, and they come in a variety of places and packages. I mean, certainly some of these families don't have a lot of marketable skills, which were there. There's a scene after they have that fight, and the van starts to drive away, and somebody said, "Look, if we left you here, you would have to find your way home together." And and that's kind of a nice line, because the sense of here are these two communities that at the time were stuck in a poor neighborhood. They weren't necessarily there totally by choice, right? Either of those communities. It's what they could afford in New York in those days. Now, none of those people can afford that neighborhood in New York, but that's a different story. Um, you know, so, but but yeah, I mean, that's one of the spots where I think the kids coming together makes sense to me, right?
Right.
And even when they fight in the second half of the film, where they can then, but the worst thing they can say about each other is something about the other, at least my father's not a crackhead, and so my father's what is your father's on Section 8, and if you don't know what Section 8 is, lucky for you, right? But that means subsidized housing.
Nice housing.
Yeah, you um, so. So there are these moments that ring sort of true in a movie that doesn't always ring true all the time, I'd say. Uh, yeah, Susan?
One of the things that I found interesting was the basketball games,
Yeah,
and that they would get along to a point,
right.
and then all of a sudden, all their prejudices and hatreds would spill out, and
Yeah,
they'd end up fighting each other.
right.
And it reminded me so much of things that could be done to bring people together where they learn how to understand each other. And I think that one of the failings of our system, even though maybe a lot of people would disagree with me, was they no longer had the draft for the armed forces.
Mhm.
Because when blacks and whites fight together um, in the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, whatever, um, there's they learn to live together and to respect one another. And I think that's kind of a failing of our
Yeah.
society.
Right. Yeah, well, look, I mean, we talk a lot about the silos that people are in. We talk a lot about the essential loneliness that's just grown over time too. Um, so whether I'd put it all on, I don't think the draft was magic either, right?
No, no, it's
No,
not.
but
But it's just
right,
one of those things that
yeah,
where and I know from our own experience with living on an Air Force base with my husband,
yeah,
and the blacks and the whites together were just fine.
right,
There was
right,
no problem.
yeah,
There was never a racial problem, not ever, that in the 3 years that we were there.
right. Yeah, well, and that's the important thing there. So whether it's through the draft, and the armed services today don't look like they did when you were there, because of the volunteer corps.
Exactly,
Almost everybody who volunteers for the military comes from a poor background these days,
exactly.
with the exception of some of the commanding officers who are legacy, who go through West Point and all that kind of stuff. So, but there just are so few places in our communities where we actually come across people who are different than we are. So it's in these neighborhoods like Crown Heights where people are sort of forced into a space together that they either are going to fight with each other or learn to live with each other. And probably the earliest days of integrating the army, I think, was like that too, from what I hear. And you guys were a little bit after that because
Right.
Truman integrated the armed forces, I think, in 1947.
Yeah. And I'm talking about the early 60s.
Yeah, yeah. But you're right. I mean, that the integrating the army was a pathway to integrating the rest of the United States. Although that integration, of course, hasn't really fully come into being, and certainly not comfortably come into being. So, but that's what we're looking at, right? Is so where are the places now, if any, where people of different faiths and different races actually come together. So I chose this movie in part because I knew it was going to be right after Dr. King weekend, and so that's um, I was in two different black churches over this weekend. Um, so we try to come together when we can and do things together. So. But there are very few places in our society that allow for that kind of interaction. Very few neighborhoods, frankly, including the ones we live in, that are integrated. And most of that now is, we would say that's a function of class rather than race, I think. But it still happens because of it. So um, so it does a good job of pointing out the problem, right?
Um, Linda and then Sandy.
One place that you can integrate and learn about other people is if you're working in an office downtown. I mean, this is before 2020,
Yeah,
but every office I worked in, every company I worked in, had to integrate with everyone. And I had made friends with all different type of people, and we talked and we got to know each other. Unfortunately, now people are all working at home and they're isolated, and I don't think they're getting out there to work with each other.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really true, right? And we are seeing these statistics that don't just start with COVID. They go back, a generation already, but less and less people in general have less human interactions, less time speaking to people, certainly face to face. And I don't know if we can even count this, our
I
Zoom
don't consider
gatherings
Zoom.
is face to face, but in every category, we have less, every age range, everything, less human interactions than we used to have.
I have another question, Rabbi,
Yeah,
that, and I might be way off on this, but I thought that Orthodox Jews did not believe in physical violence. And I was very surprised when I was seeing these teenage boys get into a fight, or that he was going to have an ice pick in his pocket. I was very surprised at that because that was my interpretation, but I
yeah.
might be very wrong in that.
Yeah, well, look, there's a difference between what the Torah teaches and what people do, right?
Right.
So the Torah certainly, and even more in the Talmud, they talk about how to solve problems by peaceful means, and it's like that. Um, but I will say, there was the question this past election whether the Jewish electorate changed any. Did more people vote for Trump? And statistics after the election showed that virtually the same, right? That about 70% of Jews vote Democratic and 30% don't. So who are those 30%? And um, the among them are people who are very much in favor of the Republican reading of the Second Amendment, right? There's a guy in the movie, it goes by fast, you may have missed it, the guy in the bakery who says, every Jew at 22, right? Every Jew needs a gun. So there are Jews who believe that, right? And they make up a sizable minority within the Jewish people. So I don't know if Orthodox Jews are more prone to violence than non-Orthodox Jews, but they are definitely more prone to gun ownership than Orthodox Jews, than Reform Jews. I think that part of that is, the neighborhoods they live in, right? So um, the they don't tend to be among the wealthiest. There are exceptions, of course, but so they end up in these communities that are sort of the borderlines, and so it's I don't think it's out of character for a group of yeshiva buchers to mix it up with people. It may have been at one point. It's not anymore. You know, so
Sandy.
Linda's comments remind me of yeshiva bochers not fighting or believing in violence. She hasn't met the Orthodox that live in the West Bank, obviously.
yeah, right. Yeah.
But my question, Rabbi, is what year was this film? Was this film made twice?
Not this story. I mean, there's two movies called Crown Heights,
Heights, right.
but they're two
I
completely
think I
different.
saw a different movie than you're even talking about.
Right.
You may have seen the wrong one.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was dark. It was a very good story and true. And my God, there were a lot of white detectives who framed people and black detectives.
Yeah,
that
that's a
framed
completely
people.
different movie.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
saw. And that's
Okay.
what I lived through because I grew up on the west side of Chicago and
Mhm.
then married a South Sider and lived on the South Side. So I spent 16 years working just in black high schools.
Right.
And it wasn't so odd. And at the end of the film, I actually cried in the very end of the film. But I believe I saw an
Yeah,
entirely
you did.
different film.
Yeah, maybe I'll watch the other one. I don't know the one that you saw at all, but
Well, how would I have, I just asked for Crown.
You needed Crown Heights, Howie Mandel, because otherwise you ended up with the Crown Heights, which was a trial, correct?
Right.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You had to put in Howie Mandel, and then you got the one we saw.
Oh, I was listening to all of you and I was thinking, I didn't see
Right.
that movie.
yeah, no, the one we saw is all about Orthodox kids in Crown Heights and black kids in Crown Heights. Mhm.
This other one has almost nothing to do with Jews.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I wouldn't pick that one probably, but it sounds like an interesting film. Maybe I'll go back and take a look at it. So Neil, what did Neil put in the chat about the electorate?
Neil said, just looked it up, 27% of the Jews voted for Trump, 3/4 of Orthodox voted for Trump. As the rabbi said, probably due to class.
Yeah.
I disagree with that. I mean, I think it has to do with Israel and some of those Orthodox
I actually
Jews are
think the two
poor.
major issues, Israel is maybe the third issue, but the two major issues for the Orthodox community are the Second Amendment and schools.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
The school voucher programs and should religious schools get federal funding, right? And those have been the things that have kept a sizable
We
group
didn't
of
watch the
Orthodox
right
Jews
movie.
voting more conservatively than the rest of
This
the
is
Jewish
called
population
Crown
for
Heights. That's what they
a
gave
long
me at the
time.
library.
So
But it's Crown Heights by Howie.
I was somewhat confused on the level of orthodoxy in the family because they certainly were not Haredi. okay? And at other times, they wanted to give the impression they weren't modern Orthodox. I couldn't get a handle on where they really were.
So
Um,
I think this is a fairly good portrayal of Chabad Hasidim, right? Who are not exactly Haredi, right? They wear, they wear black and they wear their tzitzit out and they keep their heads covered and things like that. But think about if you've had any experience with like the Chabad on Central Avenue in Highland Park, they would be
Right.
very happy if any of us showed up there, right?
right, but
They are interested in making Jews who are less traditional more traditional.
then I think at the ball game or something,
Yeah.
the Orthodox girls were there. I think you know,
Hmm.
um, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
and stuff. Um, and I know our grandson, when they had to play basketball for Rochelle Zell, they had to go. They couldn't play at Fastman because the girls were coming to the game, etc. So that's what sort of got me a bit confused.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
You
not,
know, I don't think it was a very, I don't mean to say honest portrayal, but realistic portrayal of, who they really were.
yeah, there are moments that I think that, yeah, where, look, the idea of an Orthodox kid listening to hip hop music in his room while he's studying Torah, maybe a Schechter kid, Vanessa, right? But
Right,
not an Orthodox kid,
right.
you know. Um, even
We have
among
to
the
ask.
Chabad.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's unusual, let's say.
yeah,
I didn't
But
realize these were Chabadniks.
yeah. And there
right,
is
they're definitely
definitely a
Chabadniks,
difference.
right? Schneerson is the
Yeah,
Rebbe,
yeah,
right? That who gets the whole thing rolling, and his house was on in Crown Heights, right, on Eastern Parkway. So his disciples are gathered around him. Um, so it was very, very definitely a Chabad community,
yeah.
which therefore includes a
Crown
number
Heights,
of
you're
people who
saying
were,
Crown Heights was a Chabad community?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
I didn't realize that. Okay.
yeah, very much a group of, there's members of the community who didn't grow up Orthodox, who become Orthodox.
Right, right.
There's a kind of there's a real mix there from those who are
Okay,
many generations of Chabad Hasidim and those who are
right,
kind of new. And the ones who
okay,
are newer tend to still be a little more
right,
modern.
right.
Since
Okay,
I think the boy says at one point that a lot of the people he knows don't have televisions, but he's on good terms with the ones who do. Right. And I think that fits for me. That actually
okay,
feels like so it is it's not a community without its nuances, right? And that's worth thinking about. And the same with the African American community, of course, that when we paint them all with one brush, then we're making a mistake, right? And so there are kids who are sensitive and they're writers and they're poets, and there's kids who are not, and we saw that in the Jewish community too, that there were kids who were willing to participate in these basketball games whose families, to some level or another, encouraged that level of dialogue. But they also encouraged that level of dialogue up to a point, right? I mean, the line is there about the relationship between boys and girls. I mean, right from the start,
right.
Howie Mandel says to Paul, that we can't bring boys and girls together. I think he said, "Girls don't fly in my community." It's an interesting phrase, but yeah, I mean, we've had that issue over the years. We wanted to do something with one of the mosques actually in town, and the stumbling block was that we couldn't bring boys and girls together. So
And I think if you look at Chabad in 2025, they're on all college campuses. They're in far-flung places, and they, appeal to the kids where the kids are. My personal kids who are out of college already for a hot minute, but they liked the cooking and they liked everything, that Chabad had to offer. And I do think Chabad has audacious hospitality. And that's a phrase that Rick Jacobs said about Reform congregations, which it does not ring true for me. But if you go into, I'm sure if you go into Chabad on Friday night, somebody would invite you home. And there's something to be said about that.
And they're also, because their funding structure is so different, they are the ones who send people to, they pay to send people to hospitals, and they pay to send people to prisons,
Yeah.
right, to do chaplaincy work. And, the reform movement, the conservative movement doesn't do that. And so that's why if you see a Jewish chaplain in a hospital, they're more likely to be Orthodox than anything, because that's who's paying their salary. Right?
And Chabad has brilliant PR, and they when the rabbi says you have to go to Detroit and there's no day school there and you have 5 children, you go. You don't argue, you just whatever the rabbi says, that's where you got to go. And many of them have these lifelong assignments.
Yeah.
Well, my experience was I did some volunteer work for many years at Misericordia. I used to go and participate. They had a Jewish service at 4 o'clock on Friday. And before Pesach and before Rosh Hashanah, the Chabad rabbi came to bless, the Jewish children, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he was there. He was definitely there.
Right. And that's it. And, I mean, uh, I've been saying to the reform movement for my whole career that they need to get into this business, but, you can't, I have my hands full with you guys, right? You know, so, I mean, they just have a different structure than we have, and we're missing out on something because of that.
But when I was in the hospital during COVID,
Hmm.
I know I talked to you, but you said you couldn't come to the hospital.
Right.
But during the week, a rabbi came, he
Yeah.
sat and he talked to me, and he left. I had wine and I had challah, and he did all of that. They left it for me, and he came back, and I even had somebody come in to the room, and they wanted me to sign something, and I said, no, I'm not going to sign it. And the rabbi that was there, he stood behind me and he said to her, she's not going to sign it.
Yeah. Yeah. But
So, I mean, they're there all the time. Even during COVID, they were there. And he didn't wear a mask and he came into my room.
yeah.
That's smart.
Yeah. And hopefully he's still around, whoever that is.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
but yeah, because the hospitals, they end up, right, he's got a special ID that I don't have, right? So that he gets from the hospital, and the hospital likes it because they don't have to pay a salary and they have a
right.
chaplain, right? But so they give him a hospital ID and he can go in, right? I didn't have a hospital ID, so
But you were talking about the Orthodox communities. They've really played havoc up in Sullivan County in New York,
uh-huh.
where they come in, they move up to an area en masse, get
Mhm.
themselves on the public school boards,
Yeah.
Right.
destroy the public school system practically,
Mhm.
and sort of take over and
Yeah.
almost drive out the local residents. And it's a real I mean, it's in upstate New York.
Yeah, right. Monmouth County, right?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right.
So yeah.
Rockland County.
Right. So I mean, this happens, and as I said, I mean, when you look at their voting pattern and why they vote the way they do, they're definitely looking
Right,
to um, either lower their taxes so they don't have to pay for public education,
Right.
or make it so religious schools benefit from the money that's collected for public education. Either of those outcomes would be okay with them, but the idea, they're sending their kids to private schools, some of them of dubious nature. I mean, there was a huge expose in the New York Times a couple of years ago
Years
about,
ago, right.
yeah, about how little kids are actually learning. Like, can they read? You know, when they leave those schools. But and then of course that becomes generational poverty because they don't have any skills, right, in the marketplace except for studying Torah. Um, so so that's a real issue, right, and a real problem. Babs?
What has changed? We always had rabbis who were able to go in and visit the sick. What changed this?
So Linda was talking about during COVID. So there was a period in COVID where when people went into the hospital, they weren't even allowed to have family members visit, right? So that's what Linda's talking about. That's during that time period.
But now you're able to go in, or
I
do
can
you?
still visit people in the hospital now. It's reopened. Some of it changes every time you go, whether you have to wear a mask or you don't have to wear a mask, all that kind of stuff. But now I can go visit people. But there was a period of time when everything was really shut down,
Okay, I understand.
where I could
Thank you.
talk to somebody by phone or text or something like that, but couldn't actually physically, you know, uh, I can't say I tested that system very much. I can't, they said don't go and it was COVID and I didn't go. So, um, would they have thrown me out if I tried to come see you, Linda? I'm not sure. I know that, they told me no, so I listened, right?
You were smart.
Yeah, you know, but so that's what we're talking about,
I
Bab. So
didn't
now
expect you to be
I
there.
will say,
I didn't
just so you
expect you.
guys know that since the HIPAA regulations went into effect, some of the things that hospitals used to do in the old days, they don't do anymore. Like I used to get a phone call occasionally from someone at Highland Park Hospital. They'd say, "You have a member here," right? And so I would hear from the hospital that someone was at the hospital, and that never happens anymore. The HIPAA regulations don't allow them to contact the clergy. I think even if you say to them that you'd like them to, they won't. So we only know when someone's in the hospital when someone from the family calls and tells us. So keep that in mind if you ever are in a position where you want a rabbi, you have a family member who wants a rabbi. I mean, you really have to let people know because you know, I could go to Highland Park Hospital and look at the census. I could look at the names of all the people who were in the hospital and see if I recognized anybody. And I would do that, right? Especially Highland Park because it was close and where more of our folks would end up than other places. Now of course with everybody's different insurance and whatever, and you know, people end up all over the place. So it's not as easy as it was. But there is no census like that anymore that's open to my perusal. So, which is funny because I think they still ask you when you check into the hospital what your religion is, but not because they're going to tell anybody. So, all right.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody. Thanks for being with us for 8 more
Thank you.
weeks of Real Jewish Classics. It's good to see you all. Stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
So, okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Thank
Bye.
you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.